Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. We have 4 episodes for you this week leading up to the matchup. There's an extra one this time around because of all the catch-up we wanted to do on the recruiting trail. If you missed our Tuesday episode this week, Tyler Calvaruso joined us for about 40 minutes of breakdown on Penn State's recruiting efforts, including their latest commitment pickup, a top 24/7 talent last Saturday, a bunch of in-state intel on top prospects across the area, flip targets who were just inside the stadium, several of them, and additionally what we're hearing on the guest list for this whiteout game against Washington. This episode of the podcast is going to focus in on those Huskies who come to town at 5-4. We'll get to that in just a moment. But as I said during that recruiting-centric episode that we threw your way Tuesday, kind of a bonus episode situation this week. So if you have missed anything along the way, I know we're going bang, bang, boom with these episodes, it seems like. Monday, we broke down the Penn State loss to Ohio State with greater detail, some feedback from James Franklin's weekly press conference. Tuesday, we had that big recruiting conversation. Wednesday, we're giving you a lot on Washington. And then Thursday, we're back with practice intel, the latest from James Franklin and his midweek availability, and our predictions, players to watch, and much more as we get set for a whiteout on Saturday night. But without further ado, here is our breakdown of the Washington Huskies. Washington comes to town. They were in the national championship game last winter. A lot has changed for that program since then, from leadership through the roster. They are 5-4 on the season, coming off a victory over USC. They are the third Pac-12 transplant that Penn State will face on the season. Of course, picking up a win in Los Angeles in October, and also before then beating UCLA in Beaver Stadium. Penn State's considered a 13-point favorite last I checked at Caesars Sportsbook. And to learn more about the Huskies, we bring on board from within the 24/7 Sports Network, Washington reporter Chris Fetters. Chris, welcome to the show. Welcome to the Big Ten. Thanks for being here with us.
Hi, Tyler. Appreciate it.
Like I said, Washington, UCLA, USC, we're not going to see Oregon on the schedule this year, but they're the number one team in the country. There is a lot of intrigue about what these teams have meant to the Big Ten and maybe what the Big Ten has meant to these programs. And that's where I want to start with you. The acclimation process, the transition process for Washington, what stands out about that so far? And big picture, what would you consider to be the considerable opportunities and the notable challenges that are in play with this move?
Well, yeah, the opportunities obviously were guided by financial decisions in the wake of the demise of the Pac-12. USC and UCLA obviously started that ball rolling when they decided to join the Big Ten. And then obviously Washington and Oregon, when they were invited to come to the Big Ten, it was kind of a no-brainer because at that point, the Pac-12 had very little in terms of the media contracts and the options available to them. So it was just one of those things where it made a lot of sense financially. Who knows? I think you talk about things that have stood out so far this season. I think clearly the travel has been probably the biggest storyline altogether in terms of just having to go back east, whether it's a Friday night game at Rutgers or these kind of this bye sandwich that Washington had where they had back-to-back road games at Iowa and at Indiana, where Washington's playing games at 9 a.m. local time here in Seattle. So it's just been, I think that's been a huge transition. I think just the level of competition, I think, has gone up a notch as well. So I think fans are generally really excited about the opportunities in terms of going to places that they would never have gone before. The chances to get quality non-conference games in the past with Big Ten opponents has been difficult. They've had them with Michigan. In fact, there was a home and home with Michigan that ended up, the home part of it got scrapped because they joined the Big Ten. So so Washington ended up going to Michigan when Jimmy Lake was the coach before Kalen DeBoer, and they got hammered. That was right on the heels of a loss to Montana, and that was the beginning of the end kind of for Jimmy Lake. And that was supposed to be the Michigan component of the Washington-Michigan home series that was developed that Washington never got a chance to get on the back end. So getting that Michigan game here this year was huge, just to kind of square things up and stuff like that. So just overall, I think obviously the chance to go see places they've never been has been fantastic. That'll obviously be the case with Penn State this weekend. Washington's never played at Happy Valley. This is a fantastic opportunity for all those not just Washington fans, but Washington fans who are also greater college football fans, because things like the whiteout have always been in the mythology, and people out here in Seattle and on the West Coast, I think they've always been intrigued with what a whiteout might entail, what that's like, that whole game day experience. Now they're going to get a chance to see it firsthand this weekend.
As I mentioned, Washington's 5-4 this year. They suffered a loss against Washington State out of conference back in mid-September. They picked up that win over Michigan, as you referenced, on home turf. Michigan, by the way, at that time was number 10 ranked nationally. Things have gone south for the Wolverines since then. But I think you look at Washington's big picture here. They're 5-4 in early November. And when you think about a team coming off a national championship game, if you didn't know everything that happened in between, you'd say, well, that's disappointing. But it was a whirlwind offseason. And I know you covered a lot of changes, quite an exodus. Kalen DeBoer took this team to the national championship game. Obviously, they fell in that matchup. But with Michael Penix, there was a lot of attention on this program throughout the year. So can you, from your vantage point, tell us what exactly went down this offseason and just how different the team that emerged for the 2024 kickoff was than the team that closed up shop in the national title game?
Yeah, I mean, for those that cover 24/7 and know, like, the Cover 3 podcast, and Bud Elliott does a great summer series with all the colleges kind of going back and recapping all that stuff. I mean, we could then do an entire podcast just on Washington's off season. We literally, outside of maybe a week or two in July, when the new coaches got a chance to go, take a vacation, spend time with their families, things like that, it has really been nonstop. I mean, literally as nonstop as we've been a part of, and we've been doing this since the mid-90s. So it's just one of those things where you go to the highs of the national championship game, and then literally within 72 hours, the whole program has been turned upside down. Kalen DeBoer goes to Alabama to take over for Nick Saban. And then 48 hours after that, Washington goes and picks off Jedd Fisch from Arizona. And then they have to go pick off Brent Brennan from San Jose State to go to, and it's just the food chain, the kind of cycle of life in college football. It's amazing that the thing with Nick Saban impacted thousands of lives. When you talk about ancillary staff members, other coaches, their families, everything else that was involved in that move was incredible. I think someone this summer kind of broke down exactly how many lives that thing impacted, but Washington for sure was right at the top of the food chain of the teams impacted. And like you said, if you just looked at the records, and you look at Michigan as well. I mean, they lose their head coach, but at least they were able to recruit from within with Sharon Moore. So they are able to keep some continuity a little bit with what was going on. But with Washington, it was wholesale changes. Everybody brand new was coming in. They went, completely brand new. Jordan Paopao now, he did have a stint at Washington as the tight end coach under Chris Peterson. So there was something there with that. But other than that, really everybody else was pretty brand new. Fisch did spend some time with Seattle Seahawks. So he understood Seattle and Brennan Carroll. And so there was some connections there. But in terms of like the defense, for instance, bringing in Steve Belichick all the way over from New England, he brings in Vinny Cincinnati, that whole thing was completely new. No one at Washington who, especially for us who have covered this thing for, 30 years almost, had no idea what to expect, what this thing was going to look like. I think Fisch, when he first got there, he said that there were less than 50 scholarship guys. I mean, they've done a fantastic job to be able to get that thing back to where it is. I think they're in the low to mid 80s, in terms of the scholarship guys. So they're continuing to rebuild as far as that goes. But yeah, it's been absolutely nonstop. It's been borderline crazy.
Washington opened 2-0, then dropped 4 of 6. And so how important would you deem that USC matchup last week? Because obviously every game's important for Lincoln Riley right now. We know he's under the microscope. But when you look at Washington in particular, it would have been a 3rd consecutive loss for them. It would have been the 5th loss in 7 games. It would have dropped them under 500, heading to Happy Valley. Can you kind of give us the impact of that result last Saturday and what it might mean for the team's confidence making this trip?
Yeah, I mean, they still have road games against, again, now I know you guys are either ranked 6th or 7th, whatever that is, but Penn State, that would have been, if they had beaten Ohio State, your top 3 team in the country minimum. You might move up a spot, who knows. And then their very last game of the season is at Oregon, who happens to be the number 1 team in the country right now. So they have 2 home games, which would have been USC, which they won. And then they have UCLA on a Friday night after they play you guys, a late game kickoff on the East Coast. So again, scheduling guys really didn't do Washington many favors. But then again, it would be really, really hard to give a West Coast team a lot of favors in the way that this thing has come down. I'm sure USC fans, UCLA fans, Oregon fans probably are going to have various gripes about whatever schedule is going to come out. So you play the hand that you're dealt, you play the games the way they come. And it just so happens that after playing these 9 a.m. local starts in Indiana and Iowa, which were kind of a killer schedule-wise, they actually went out 2 days early to try to get acclimated with the early schedule and everything else that comes with that. They even tried to practice early. So, like, again, this week, they're going to be practicing at night. They're going to be trying to acclimate themselves for what would be a 5 p.m. Seattle time start. And so, yeah, it's been just a crusher, but they had to win. In short, they had to beat USC to get bowl eligible. And when you're in a first-team program, as you well know, you can get up to those. Now, they won't have 15 practices for a bowl game because I'm sure whatever bowl game they play in, it'll probably be somewhere around Christmas time, give or take a week. But it's you're just not going to cram 15 practices in there. But the bottom line is you get all those extra that extra time to be able to build the program, continue to roster build, continue to get the younger guys engaged, guys that were redshirting, guys that haven't played very much. For instance, that the USC game at the final play of USC's final drive, a guy, Lance Holtzclaw, one of their young edge guys, comes in and literally makes the play of the game. Should have come up with a sack, but he forces Miller Moss into a pass that just goes to nobody. And he's a guy that you want to keep engaged. He only had 1 snap the entire game, so you want to keep fostering those guys and developing them and keeping them going and involved and interested. So everything that they can do to get bowl eligible, they're going to try to do. And obviously this weekend is going to be an incredibly tough ask for them to win on the road, 3 time zones away, whiteout, night game, everything that comes with that. But then they've got that Friday night game at UCLA. And if they lose against Penn State, which is obviously given the line and everything else, it's pretty much everyone's expecting them to lose. That Friday night game against UCLA is the game because you cannot put everything on the line going down to Eugene against the number 1 team in the country and think you're going to come up with a win.
Washington's road struggles have been interesting. They lost to Rutgers by 3 points in late September. Rutgers has actually suffered 4 straight defeats since that matchup. They lost at Iowa in mid-October, 40-16, and then a couple of weeks ago they lost at Indiana, 31-17. You mentioned the last 2 road games don't offer much reprieve with Penn State and Oregon on the agenda, but is there anything specific aside from obviously the maybe the intensified travel for a Pac-12 transplant that has been a problem for them away from home?
Well, you could certainly make the argument that that's kind of the cherry over on the top of the sundae of things that were already conspiring against Washington all season long. Because if you'd followed Washington, you'd know that early on, major problems with like pre-snap penalties. They had 16 penalties against Washington State, for instance, and they lose that game basically on the final play. They still had a chance to win on the final play of the game, tried to run a short side option. Didn't work, got stuffed, and so Washington State wins that game. And it's not really a true road game because it's literally down the road at Lumen Field where the Seahawks play. And so you've got that going on. But then they go to Rutgers on that short week on the Friday night game. They rack up 520 yards of offense, but come up with 18 points because they missed 3 field goals. They had some really crucial penalties. Like they come up with a ball, I think like on a block, or I can't remember what the turnover was, but then they come up with an illegal substitution because a player went on the field to celebrate while the game was still going, while the play was still going. So it's just little things like that kind of conspired to really create problems. And then going up against Iowa and Indiana, just running the ball the way that those guys do, those are the kind of Big Ten offenses that I think people here in Seattle historically would have expected from a Big Ten team, power game, 3 yards in a cloud of dust, stuff that I think they'll expect Saturday night as well. And excuse me. So, and it's just, again, there's just all these things, but the travel, like I said, it's just been on top of all the other things that have happened. But you could, if you're a Washington fan, you could obviously make a very credible argument that really you'd only be 4-2 on the road and really 3-2 in true Big Ten road games. And then obviously that Apple Cup game with Washington State was kind of a catastrophe all the way around. So I think the road thing has been exacerbated a little bit. I certainly expect Washington to be very competitive against Penn State on Saturday night. Again, the odds makers and everyone else expects Washington to lose. I expect them to lose, but I think it's going to be a really competitive game because I think they've had situations where even against Iowa and Indiana, they've been competitive, but in the second half, for instance, they just wore down with Caleb Johnson. He was a monster that day running the ball. Iowa didn't beat themselves. They just kind of got out of their own way, gave the ball to Caleb Johnson. That was that. Same thing in the second half. Kurt Cignetti basically said, hey, we don't need to put the backup quarterback at that time, Jackson. We don't need to put him in peril. Just give the ball off to the running backs, let them do their thing. And they had 6-7 minute drives in the second half against Washington. So 31-17, given what Indiana has done to opponents this year, it looks very respectable on the road. But the reality is Washington was really never in it after they kind of handed the ball to Indiana. Indiana was saying, we're going to play keep away. We're going to run it down your throats, and there's nothing you can do about it. And Washington wasn't able to do anything about it.
Let's go to the quarterback position with you, Chris, because Michael Penix was in the spotlight last year, runner-up for the Heisman Trophy, top 10 NFL draft pick here in 2024. Will Rogers is the replacement, and he's a guy who had a very productive career for the most part in the SEC, playing with Mississippi State. He owns over 100 total passing touchdowns in his career. He's right around 15,000 passing yards. So we're talking about a guy who has been around the block as a quarterback. What does it look like with him at the helm of this offense? And when you look around that supporting cast, who has he been able to consistently lean on the most?
Well, you could make an argument that getting Will Rogers to return to Washington, Will Rogers was an interesting case because he committed to Kalen DeBoer, and he actually went to both New Orleans and Houston for the Sugar Bowl and the national championship game. He was enrolled, he was on campus, he was doing the winter conditioning stuff, he was all ready to go. And then obviously when DeBoer leaves, that puts everyone's world into turmoil, including all the guys that had transferred, because there were a few. And so, he was one of those guys where it was absolutely critical for Washington to get a quarterback to transfer, like an experienced quarterback, because he obviously was able to get Damon Williams out of his letter of intent to Arizona. Damon Williams comes up as a true freshman, and you'll probably see Damon Williams a little bit Saturday night because he's played sparingly, but he's played basically every game this year. But Will Rogers was critical to getting an experienced guy, a guy that he can, put Damon Williams under his wing, kind of teach him, learn what's going on. Because you won't find, maybe outside of a Dylan Gabriel, you may not find a more experienced quarterback just in terms of games played and everything else than Will Rogers. I think he's on pace to be maybe top 6, top 7, maybe all time in terms of total yardage, passing yardage when it's all said and done, if he just keeps kind of going through his averages and whatnot. So he's had a remarkable career, but be very clear about the point that as much as Jedd Fisch needed him to come and be a stable part of this first year of the program build, he's not the kind of quarterback that Jedd Fisch would normally recruit. Because if you look at Arizona, you look at like Jaden Delores, you look at Noah Fafita, you look at guys like Damon Williams, and now Washington for 2025. They've got this kid from Mater Dei in the Trinity League down in Los Angeles by the name of Dash Byerly. These are all smaller kids, maybe 6 foot around roughly, but they're mobile as all get out. They're true dual threat guys. Damon Williams is a true dual threat guy. You go back to that Michigan game, for instance, that you mentioned, Tyler. They had a double pass that eventually ended up at the running back's hand, Cameron Davis, and he went for 30-some yards. It was early in the game, really kind of set the tone for Washington offensively, put them on the front foot, and allowed them to get up early in that game, while Michigan was kind of scuffling with Orji, and they moved to Jack Tuttle, and then that really changed their fortunes around offensively. And it's ironic that Jack Tuttle is actually retired from football now, like a month after he came in and almost rescued Michigan against Washington. But you look at the things offensively, and Will Rogers has been a huge part of it. But they've had to really tailor. Fish has really had to tailor his play calls and his schemes around what Will Rogers does really, really well, which is he's a pocket guy. He can get in and out of plays really well, so he can manage the game really, really well. He can get his guys in positions to make plays, but he's not mobile. He's going to give up a sack here and there because he's waited around too long, or he just gets himself in a situation where he gets boxed in, can't get out of it. So there are pluses and minuses with Will Rogers, but overall, he's done a really good job for Washington. He's done a very good job, and I think he's done exactly what Jedd Fisch would have expected from him, which is kind of stabilize the program, get the ball to the playmakers, and let them do their thing. And if there's a negative play that comes about it, if he gets sacked or something like that, you live with it because he's making more good plays than bad. And then running back Jonah Coleman is going to be the bellwether. He's continuing to get more and more carries every game. He's been kind of dinged up. After the Rutgers loss, everyone was very concerned because he wasn't at the end of the game when they really needed him. He kind of he didn't tap out, but it was like he came out and never really came back in. And everyone's like, why wasn't Jonah Coleman in the game? Because they could have really used him to move the ball closer to get a genuine field goal attempt to put that game into overtime. And Jedd Fisch admitted, he goes, he's basically at a snap count. And it's like, oh, okay, so he's been on a snap count. Well, after that bye week between the Iowa and Indiana game, he got healthy. They needed that week really, really bad to get a number of guys healthy, but specifically Jonah Coleman. And so now he's getting more and more carries. He got 19 carries at Indiana. He got 23 carries against USC. We expect him to get 20-plus carries again against Penn State because he's feeling good. He is the number one running back for Washington by a country mile. And then you'll get Cameron Davis getting the ball, as well as true freshman Adam Muhammad, who's really kind of the future of the position at running back for Washington. So you'll see those three guys there. And then receiving the ball, they lost their main tight end, Quentin Moore, who was a holdover from last year's team, the national championship team. And then he got hurt like really early, like between like Fish thinks it's between like 10 and 15 snaps into the season and got hurt. And he hasn't been able to come back. He doesn't think he's going to be able to come back. He's definitely not playing Saturday. So they're hoping he's going to get a redshirt opportunity. That's what their plan is. And they expect Fish is confident that the NCAA is going to allow him a waiver to come back. And he's confident that Moore wants to come back. He said that's all indications from him. But that left them short because they also lost one of their true freshmen, a guy named by the name of Charlie Kroll, to another injury, a season-ending injury. So the short of it is they've had basically two scholarship tight ends the entire season. And Kaleki Latu, who's a transfer from Nevada and California, and then also true freshman Decker DeGraff, who scored 2 touchdowns on his first two catches as a Husky earlier this year. So it was like basically, okay, this guy's a touchdown machine. This is great. This is perfect for a true freshman. But he's settled down and he's become kind of the pass catching tight end that I think people expected him to be. But Latu is really, really surprised more as a blocker than as the pass catching guy because he's 6'7", 245. People expected him, okay, throw the ball up, 50-50 balls and that kind of thing. He comes down with it. But he's really excelled as a blocker as well. So that's been a pleasant surprise for Washington. And then I would say as far as the receivers, you're going to have the three main receivers are going to line up. If they play like 11 personnel to start, it would be Giles Jackson at the X. And then you've got Denzel Boston at the Y. And then you've got Jeremiah Hunter at the Z. And those are the three guys. Hunter is a Cal transfer. And then Boston and Giles Jackson, probably, I don't know, Penn State fans may remember him, but he was originally a Michigan guy. And then he transferred over to Washington a few years ago. So the Michigan win was absolutely huge for Giles Jackson. I mean, he loved that win and took that thing personally. But those are the main three guys. Now they've had Keith Reynolds, who's more kind of like Giles Jackson's backup. He's a return guy as well. Had a 50-plus yard return against USC last weekend. So he's a guy that can be explosive. And then another one of the bigger receivers, a guy named Rasheed Williams, is a redshirt freshman. So those are basically the skill guys. But I would be remiss to say, Tyler, honestly, this game for Washington is going to hinge on the offensive line. And that's been the problem all year. And that was the biggest problem for Jedd Fisch in terms of this roster rebuild in the offseason, because Washington lost 20 of 22 starters from the national championship game. And the 2 starters that did come back were on defense. They literally lost everybody on offense. including the offensive line. Their two guards ended up both at Ole Miss, guys by the name of Julius Bulow and Nate Kalepo. And so it was interesting. I noticed on last Saturday that Ole Miss put up like 63 points and like 690 yards of offense, but like 560 of it was like through the air. And I'm like, okay, now I can see why Lane Kiffin wanted pass blocking guards. And Washington had two of the best ones last year, and they both went to the SEC. Parker Brailsford, the center from last year's team, went to Alabama, followed Kalen DeBoer, and then both the tackles, Troy Fautanu on the left and Roger Rosengarten on the right, both got drafted in the first two rounds. In fact, Roger Rosengarten right now starting for the Baltimore Ravens, a right tackle. So fixing that offensive line has been priority number one for Jedd Fisch on the offense, and it's been very hit and miss. I mean, they've had so many different starting lineups in that group, and they bring in, I mean, I think they have a running rotation of like 7 or 8 guys that they're using right now. And so the lineup that they used against Michigan, Khalid Tafai, the left tackle, that was his first career start. Fully expect him to start Saturday night against Penn State, but he'll be backed up by a redshirt freshman, Swanee Fa'azolo, that's also gotten starts there. They have Max McCree back, who would be their primary left tackle, a guy that actually had some starts at Maryland back in the day, but he busted up his thumb against Iowa. And he'd be back, but it sounds like, according to Fisch, it'd be basically for emergencies. So it's just been a really banged up line outside of maybe the center, D'Angelo Titiali'i, but he's a Portland State transfer that didn't come to Washington until June. So this is the other thing too. They've had 2 or 3 of their guys that play, like Enoch Vimahi, Penn State guys might know him from when he played at Ohio State. He's usually been the starting right guard, but he did not start at right guard against USC. That was Landon Hatchett. And so, but he didn't come until June. Drew Azzopardi, the right tackle, is from San Diego State. He's a transfer, but he's actually one of the very, very few guys that got here in spring and has actually been here for a little while. So you can just say it's just been a real mash unit up front, and it's going to be more of the same on Saturday night.
Very comprehensive breakdown there. As you mentioned, Coleman, truly a bell cow, 5 100-yard rushing games in 9 matchups so far. And then both Boston and Jackson at the receiver spot, over 50 catches on the season. Boston has 9 touchdown receptions through 9 games. Before we get to prediction time on this one, I want to just run the defense by you. I noticed they're giving up about 150 rushing yards per contest. That's toward the bottom end of the Big Ten overall. What are the strengths and weaknesses of that unit as it comes to Happy Valley?
Yeah, it's basically that simple, Tyler. They just kind of hang on with the run game, but when they have been able to get offenses one-dimensional and they have to throw the ball, like if they get ahead and force teams to really kind of have to play catch-up, that's been their strength. And so the back end has been really strong that way. And yes, you can say the number one pass defense in the Big Ten nationally, they're great and all that stuff. But until last weekend against USC, you can make a very strong argument they didn't play anybody else that threw the ball outside of Indiana, and Indiana was playing Taven Jackson, their backup quarterback, and they wanted to protect him and everything else. But that outside of Indiana until the USC game, there had not been a team that Washington had faced that threw the ball for more than an average of 210 yards per game. So really what they're going to see on Saturday night with Penn State, I'm assuming, is probably a little bit more of the same, where I would think Penn State would want to rely on the run game, really pound at that Washington defensive line and see if they can break them down eventually. Maybe a lower scoring game. Maybe it's something where teams will, where Penn State will just say, hey, we'll take a 21-13 win, or we'll take a 24-17 win, or whatever, but we are going to pound the ball at you. We're going to possess the ball. We're going to play keep away, and we're going to protect everything that we've got, because we don't think you've got the offense that can consistently score against us, which has kind of been the recipe for teams that have played against Washington, especially when they're at home and they know that Washington has struggled in Big Ten games on the road. So yeah, it's one of those things where they are decent enough up front. I mean, Carson Bruner, the linebacker, Penn State fans should know about him. He was the reigning Big Ten Defensive Player of the Week. He had 12 tackles against USC, but he also had 2 interceptions. And so he's been really active. He's been getting after it. Alfonso Tupatala is the guy next to him. He's one of the guys that actually played in the national championship game last year as a starter. So the middle of Washington's linebacking core is very strong, very experienced, very veteran. The guys up front are pretty veteran too, but they're not I mean, I wouldn't say they're just guys, but they're not guys that are going to kill you. Like, you look at Penn State and I see Abdul Carter and I'm thinking, well, Khalid Tafai or whatever tackle he's going to go up against is going to have, they're going to have to bring their lunch pails with them because they're going to have a long day. Washington can't necessarily say the same thing. Their main edge player, Zach Durfee, has been in and out all season long. Doesn't sound like he's going to be available Saturday. And so that makes it tough. But they did bring back a player in Russell Davis, who was a transfer from Arizona, who made his first appearance against USC this year. And so he's kind of an unknown entity. He may be able to create some damage because there's no film on him from this year. They'd have to go back. The Penn State coach would have to go back to his Arizona days to find film on him. But then you got Isaiah Ward, another Arizona guy who kind of fills that gap a little bit. I'm wondering seriously about a guy like Lance Holtzclaw. Comes in one play, basically almost sacks the quarterback. Is he a guy that they can bring in situationally more to create problems for Drew Aller? I mean, I don't know what the secret's going to be for Steve Belichick, but I give full marks to Belichick and total credit to that defensive staff. They've made things really, really tough for opposing offenses in various ways. They've always been able to scheme pretty well. I understand that the Iowa game and the Indiana game are going to skew the numbers a little bit. Those games kind of got out of hand. And you look at the Iowa game specifically, that game got really out of hand in the second half because Washington kept going for it offensively, kept giving the ball away because they were trying to get back in the game. They weren't converting on fourth downs. They were giving up some short fields, giving up some other things. And that was a real problem. So Penn State fans should know that Washington they're going to find a way to try to limit whatever Penn State's going to try to do offensively. And again, you look at the USC game, and the whole time we're thinking, why is Lincoln Riley throwing the ball? I mean, I understand that's his DNA. I understand that's what he wants to do. But if you look at what they did first half, second half, and you saw what he did with Woody Marks, Quentin Joyner running the ball in the second half, that's like, for Washington fans, that's like their worst nightmare because you could see it unfold in real time. If Lincoln Riley could simply have gotten out of his own way and just let Miller Moss hand the ball off and do those types of things, Washington would have lost that game. Would have lost that game plain and simple. So, and in Indiana almost lost the game against Washington until Kurt Cignetti literally just said, and he said it in the post-game press conference. He said, once we decided, we were like, screw it. We're just going to run the ball at them, and we're just going to take our chances, and we're just going to run it down their throats continuously. They ended up, again, like 7-minute drives. Washington couldn't get the ball back. And once they got behind the sticks, it was over, game over. So I'm just thinking if James Franklin can get out of his own way, if the OC can get out of his own way, if they just hand the ball off to Penn State's capable running backs and they run behind that big offensive line and they continue to break Washington down defensively, I think that's the easiest way and the simplest way if they just get out of their own way and make that thing happen, because it's proven time and time again when the other team has done that, they've shown to have a lot of success against Washington.
It's still bizarre to me to hear Stephen Belichick referenced as a defensive coordinator out there for Washington. We were undergrads together at Rutgers. He was a lacrosse player. It's just but so crazy to me that he's now a defensive coordinator at this level. I know he had a little bit of a head start with his dad, but it's still pretty wild to consider. I wanted to jump into one last thing here with you, and that's our forecast, or your forecast in particular. I'll give mine a little bit later here this week, but as we record on a Tuesday, I want to note it's Tuesday morning on your end, Tuesday afternoon on ours, so relatively early in the week. But when you kind of, in your mind's eye, imagine how this one plays out in Beaver Stadium on Saturday night, what do you anticipate, and do you have a score in mind?
Yeah, and I'll be perfectly honest, Tyler, outside of the Ohio State game, which I watched a bunch of, and the USC game, which I watched a bunch of, I haven't really paid too much attention to what Penn State's all about. I mean, I understand, I can look at the stats and I can see all that kind of stuff. And Drew Allers is a guy nationally that even Washington fans would have known about even from afar because of what he's been able to do and as a quarterback. And I think that there's probably some similarities between a guy like Drew Aller and Will Rogers, frankly, in terms of just being really, really good game managers. The only difference is that Allers is bigger, stronger. There might be more of a run threat with Aller if he needs to, at least in terms of escapability and scrambling. Compared to Rodgers. And also I'll have my specific score prediction out on Dogman later on in the week on Friday. But I will tell you this, I'm not predicting a Washington win. What I would predict is that once I saw the line and it's between 13 and a half so far. I don't know where it'll move to, but I think that Washington will keep it within that. I mean, I'd be right now, if I had to just hazard a score, I'm thinking probably in like the 27-17 range, 31-21 range, something like that. I'm thinking it's probably about a 10-point difference that I would anticipate. But again, it's the formula against Washington in terms of what Penn State's offense can do against Washington's defense, given Washington's strengths, what they've been good at. It's so straightforward. I mean, it's like the Geico ads. A caveman could do it. It's not difficult. It really isn't rocket science, guys. You hand the ball off to your running backs. You convert on third down. You mix in some short passes. Maybe you try to take a play or two over the top if Washington gets caught cheating. But they've really done a great job. They play too high. They really try to keep everything in front of them. It's so they found ways defensively to stay in games. They've always allowed Washington to stay in games. And again, as I mentioned, the Iowa game, the Indiana game, they may look like outliers, but trust me, by halftime in both those games were both in doubt at halftime. And then the other thing that I would say that we have really talked about is special teams. And again, Washington lost the game in big part at Rutgers based on special teams, missing 3 field goals. Grady Gross hit 2 field goals against USC. It feels like he's kind of got his mojo back a little bit because he was so good. He only missed 4. I think he was like 20 of 24, something like that last season. Was a huge part, had a game-winning field goal at Washington State and ended up earning a scholarship in the locker room after that game. It was such a big deal. And so, but he went in a real funk in the middle of this season. I mean, he was just missing field goals for fun at some point, but he made 2 big field goals. One was like a 45-yarder in the pouring rain, and it was windy as hell last Saturday night. So that was big for his confidence. So I think he's back. I would expect him to be a factor a little bit. But special teams in terms of the cover games, return games have been difficult. Outside of this 50-yard return that Keith Reynolds had, they've been very deficient in terms of the return game. And cover game's been brutal. I mean, very, very first kickoff against USC, and Mekhi Lemon breaks off like a 50, 60-yard return. USC's first 2 offensive series were both in Washington territory because their punter, Jack McAllister, Washington's punter, basically kind of almost shanked the kick after a 3-and-out on Washington's first possession. They were like basically at the 35-yard line. And but Washington, again, with Belichick and those guys have done a phenomenal job of stonewalling teams in the red zone. They had a goal line stand, second to last series of the game, and then they had one in the red zone with the last play of the game. So they've found ways to keep Washington's team in it offensively. And now it's up to Washington to see what they can do against Penn State's, really formidable defense. That's going to be the challenge ultimately, to see how you can score some points and overcome the initial kind of whiteout excitement and enthusiasm that's going to come with that Saturday night. Because there's going to be a wave where they're going to look at those stands and see 110,000 people there in white and the pom-poms and everything else. And they're probably going to freak out a little bit. I mean, I'd freak out a little bit. I'd just be looking at going, what are we here? What are we doing? And they got to get over that quickly. And how quickly they can get over that and overcome that initial kind of burst and like, okay, we got to, it's still ball. It's still 53.5 yards across. The field's still, it's like the old Hoosiers thing, right? The field's still the same dimensions, same everything. Just got to go out and play ball. How quickly they can get into that and quickly gain some success, that's really going to tell the tale. And that's why, as dumb and as cliche as it sounds, Tyler, this game is going to be won and lost in the trenches. Washington has to find consistency on the offensive and defensive lines Saturday night in order to have any sort of success, whether it's stopping Penn State or being able to move the ball against the Nittany Lions. That's going to really tell the tale. And right now, it's on a knife's edge. They have success. They've shown success. They haven't been consistent at it, but they've shown that they have the talent to do it. Now they just got to go out and do it.
Chris Fetters covers Washington for the 24/7 Sports Network as we turn the page from Ohio State. Chris, really appreciate the breakdown. I certainly know a lot more about the Huskies now. I think our listeners and viewers do too. Enjoy the rest of your game week, and we'll see what happens on Saturday night.
Yeah, I can't wait. I mean, I was really kind of heads or tails of whether I was going to get out there, but we've also got literally a basketball game going on at the same time as the football game. So I have to be here kind of command central back in Seattle, kind of covering both things, but can't wait. I know there's so many Washington fans that are going out there specifically for the opportunity to experience a whiteout and experience that kind of culture and experience that kind of Big Ten. This, I think, really outside of Indiana, I'm sure was a good experience, but Iowa and Penn State, I think you're really starting to get into the programs that have that tradition and everything else that kind of goes with being in the Big Ten. And I think after this whiteout game, I think Washington fans that have made the effort to go out to Happy Valley to experience the thing and go, okay, this is Big Ten. Now we're in the Big Ten. This is what it feels like. So I think they're going to have a lot of fun.
Chris, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your Big Ten experience, and you'll be settling in the future seasons, I'm sure.
Thanks, Tyler. I appreciate it.
Good stuff from Chris. And there you go. The Washington Huskies, a team that was in the national championship last year, but a matchup that looks different than it did when we first saw it on the calendar. But there is a lot to go through in this one. Washington, a capable program. We've seen them play up to the moments at times this year. We've also seen them not be able to meet the moment on the road in Big Ten action on a few occasions as well. So we'll see what happens on Saturday. Between now and then, we're going to come back to you with another podcast breaking down our sights and sounds from the Penn State practice field. We'll be back out there Wednesday evening. We'll give you the latest, what we saw, what we heard from James Franklin afterward, and our final thoughts, predictions, and preview from a Penn State angle for this matchup against Washington. For now, stepping aside, I am Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.